So I guess I'm the first of the cryptography talks for the day, and the focus of my talk is going to be specifically on the issue of authentication. So fundamentally, what we're trying to look at here is the question of who is this message from? Bob receives a message. Is it really from Alice, or is it from somebody who's trying to impersonate Alice in order to confuse him? And as a property, this is clearly something that's useful in its own right. You can think of contexts where this matters, but it's also an important consideration in accomplishing more complex cryptographic tasks. So a lot of more complex protocols necessarily involve authentication components to prevent certain attacks. And even if you're starting with something as seemingly straightforward as confidentiality, and that's really all you want, to prevent certain types of active attacks, you may need authentication to get involved as well. So that would be a factor in something like padding attacks on CBC mode encryption, or something like even quantum key exchange, to be a bit out there. These things that are out there to provide confidentiality still have this requirement for authentication. And I guess a slide to say what my talk is not about. And these are the tools that get used in practice, right? So things that you might be using on a daily basis. From a public key point of view, the tools that are providing authentication would be your digital signature schemes, things like RSA, ECDSA, and for symmetric cryptography, when you need things to be more efficient, the message authentication code is kind of the practical version of what I'm going to be talking about today. But both of these rely on, well, any security relies on making some kind of assumptions. So in the case of the public key, you're setting up systems that are relying on making some assumption about how much computational power would an attacker have. Even for these symmetric message authentication codes, you're still using schemes that are based on assumptions. If they're constructed from, say, a block cipher or something like that, you are evaluating the security of your scheme, usually by making some kind of assumptions about the property of the block cipher. So instead, what I'm going to be talking today is about an unconditionally secure setting where we're not making any assumptions about what the adversary can do. They may even have a quantum computer, and we don't mind about that. Of course, there's always a trade-off, and these are not schemes that are practical for everyday use. So I guess the sort of motivating examples that get thrown around would be something like protecting nuclear launch codes or something like that, where authentication is so paramount that you're willing to pay the price. So if you're familiar with the sort of Shannon's notion of perfect secrecy for encryption schemes and the one-time pad and that sort of thing, this is essentially the equivalent of that, but in trying to study authentication instead. And so the models that I'm looking at today are basically those essentially set up by Gus Simmons, sort of starting from the 80s. So just a quick overview of what I'm going to be talking about with these authentication codes. So the basic setting, we have a set of sources that we think of as being the set of possible things that Alice might be trying to communicate to Bob, just some finite set. We have a set of messages. So to distinguish from the sources are what we want to communicate, but we're going to somehow encode them as some kind of a message. So that's the actual thing that gets sent. Again, just a finite set. We have a finite set of keys. So in this unconditional setting, how do Alice and Bob get an advantage over an attacker? It's by having a shared secret key that the attacker doesn't know. So that's the one sort of piece that all our security is going to derive from. And so associated with each of these keys, we have an encoding rule. So this encoding rule says we pick our element of our source space, and given what our shared key is, that's going to allow us to work out what message do we encode it as to send it to Bob. So Alice wants to communicate the source S. The shared key is K. So she computes, she applies the encoding rule EK to the source S, gets the message T, and sends. So all right, sends the message to Bob, and well, Bob asked the question, this message I received, given what the key is this a properly formed message that was the result of applying one of these encoding rules? And if it is, he says, great, this really was from Alice. If it isn't, he says, oh dear, something's gone wrong. This must be a bogus message of some kind. So I'm going to go into more detail about the structure of these, but first, why am I talking about these today? And that's really two different questions. So why me and why today? So I'm going to give a little bit of history, but you might be able to spot that actually a lot of the history and a bulk of the work that's been done on these things sort of happened before I got involved in the area. So in some ways, this is not really my story to tell, and I know there are plenty of people out there who were heavily involved in this literature at the time. So I will beg your pardon for being bold enough to speak on it. And so my perspective is that of somebody coming into this literature, trying to make sense of what has been done and looking at kind of what questions do I still have about that? So that's kind of the perspective I'm communicating today. And as for why today, today in the sense of the year 2022, and I'm hoping to convince you with this talk that actually there are still some interesting questions about these objects in this current day. And if we ask why today in the context of our Stinson 66 conference, well, that's a lot more straightforward to answer. So if you go on DBLP and you look at Doug's page and you just type in authentication codes, you can bring up a list of work that he was doing throughout the 80s and throughout the 90s and 2004. And the list actually continues, but I don't have space on the slide. So you can see that this is an area, one of many areas in which Doug has been heavily involved and had quite an impact on the literature. So I guess I started my PhD in 2002, and you could even see from the, well, if you can see the small writing, there were just too many items to fit. From the dates of those items, we're looking a lot of work being done in the 80s and maybe even more so in the 90s. And there's an extensive literature out there about these authentication codes. So just a little partial screenshot. Here's an online bibliography you can still find that Ru Zhong and Doug were compiling. Don't know if the text is readable, but you can see a date here of 1998. And at that point, we had 127 entries in that bibliography. And this is a bibliography that is no longer being kept up to date. And I think that's kind of reflective of the trend of what happened in the literature. So from my perspective, I get the impression by talking to people who are involved in this area that basically researchers got a bit carried away and wrote too many papers on the subject. And then they all sort of moved on and put it behind them, which is all very well. And if we look at, this was an alphabetical bibliography, so it's not thematic or time ordered or anything, but just this little snapshot of some of them here. What's going on? You can see authentication codes from unitary geometry, symplectic geometry, symplectic spaces, whoops, symplectic geometry, Veronese varieties. So a lot of finite geometers getting involved in this space. And so I guess if you have your favorite object in finite geometry, you can ask yourself the question, can I turn this into an authentication code? And as this literature shows, the answer is probably yes. And maybe a more nuanced question is, should I? So to answer that question, we need to look at these codes in a bit more detail and find out what are these codes? What is it that we're actually looking for from a good authentication code? So here's a very small and not very good authentication code, but just to kind of give some sense of the structure of these things. So in this case, our set of possible messages, we've just got 0 or 1. We've got 5 different keys, 5 different values that we can encode our messages as. And a convenient way of representing an authentication code is in a kind of a table like this. And the intention of this table is you find the row for a specific key. Let's just take key 0. And if I want to communicate the message 0, I can see that under the column of EK of 0, my encoding rule, I've got 2 choices, 1 or 4. So I just flip a coin and I pick one of those values. So in this case, it's a randomized encoding. So 1 and 4 would be my encoding of 0, or either 2 or 3 would be an encoding of 1. And just a few comments about probabilities here, because we have a lot of different probability distributions going on in this little table here. So we have a probability distribution on the keys, and as is fairly standard, we're just going to assume keys are chosen uniformly and independently of the source. So you imagine before anything else goes on, we just flip our coins and draw our key. We also have a probability distribution on the sources, and there are different models that you can study and which have all been looked at various aspects. You might assume that the sources are uniformly distributed. You might assume that the sources had some fixed distribution that wasn't uniform, or you might even want to study codes that would work for arbitrary source distributions. So just to keep things simple today, I'll focus on the case of uniform sources, but these other things can and have been studied. With respect to the encoding as well, we're going to assume that we just have a set of possible encodings and we're picking uniformly from within that set. So once you know these distributions on the keys and the sources and the encodings, that completely determines a distribution on what the possible messages can be. So like I said, many different probability distributions floating around here. And so what we've described is the basic setup, but of course we've left out the most important thing, which is security. What do we mean by security for one of these schemes? And principally, there are 2 different possible types of attack that we're worried about. We have our impersonation attack, which is where Oscar just comes along and sends a message to Bob and hopes that Bob will believe it's from Alice. So we're assuming that Oscar knows this entire table. He knows what all these probability distributions are. But what we're going to assume is he doesn't know which key they're using. And yeah, so for the impersonation attack, that's the one thing he doesn't know. The next attack that we're also worried about is substitution. So that's where Bob is sending a message to Alice and Oscar sees that message. And as the name suggests, he takes it and replaces it by a different message. So this is a genuinely different process because Oscar has a bit more information. He's seen this message that's being sent, but also what we're trying to evaluate is fundamentally different. Because you can imagine, let's say the key was 0, and let's say Bob was sending the message 1. If Oscar replaced that 1 by a 4, then actually that wouldn't really have any impact because 4 is still a valid encoding of 0. So Bob would say, oh, great, Alice is sending me the message 0. So despite all his work, Oscar hasn't upset anything. So what we're really worried about is, what if Oscar replaces it with a 2 or a 3 that is a valid encoding of a different source? So he would fool Bob into thinking, oh, Alice is telling me 1, when really Alice had intended to say 0. So that's our substitution attack. And if we have a look at this little example, using these probability distributions we've set up, we can work out what is the probability that Oscar is going to succeed when he makes one of these attacks. So for impersonation, let's suppose Oscar doesn't know what the key is and he just decides to send a 1. So you can see Oscar would succeed if the key was 0, because 1 is valid there. But if the key was 1, 1 isn't a valid encoding of either source for the key 1. So Oscar would fail in that case, but he would succeed here or here or here. So 4 of these 5 keys, Oscar would succeed. And so for that particular choice, he's got a 4 and 5 probability of succeeding. And actually, because of the symmetry of this example, with any choice he makes, he's got probability of 4 and 5. And when we're talking about impersonation probability here, we're worried about the worst case. So worst case from Bob's point of view, best case from Oscar's point of view. So if Oscar makes his best possible choice that's most likely to succeed, how likely is that? And we want to design our code in such a way that it's not very likely. So the fact that Oscar has a 4 and 5 chance of success means this is actually a pretty rubbish authentication code. But we'll move on to looking at some better constructions later. And from the substitution point of view, Oscar is seeing an element and replacing it by something else. So again, if we look at the key 0, and let's suppose that Oscar this time sees a 1. So we've already said he doesn't win if he replaces it by a 4. If he replaces it by a 0, Bob will be able to detect that that's not right. But if he replaces it by a 2 or a 3, he will win. And so when it comes to computing this probability of substitution, when he's seeing a 1, he's obviously not going to replace it by a 1. So there's 4 other things, and 2 of them were correct. So we had probability 1/2 here. And in general, you could think of the attacker having a substitution strategy where he says, right, if I see a 1, I'm going to give a 3. If I see a 2, I'm going to give a 0 or whatever. And so for a given substitution strategy, you can work out the probability it will succeed. And again, we're interested in what's the worst case, or worst case / best case, depending on who you are, of Oscar succeeding at the substitution. So what are our aims when we're trying to build our table to describe our authentication code? We would, for practical reasons, obviously like to keep the set of keys as small as possible. Actually, it's the size of the key space that's one of the main aspects that make these things impractical for daily use. But nonetheless, we'd like it still to be, we would like to reduce the amount of impracticality. So we'd like our key space small. We want our set of messages to be small because we're always taking a slightly smaller set of sources to a slightly bigger set of messages, which is essentially message expansion. We're having to send more information than strictly what we're trying to communicate. So we'd like to get that small as well. But on the other hand, we're trying to keep these impersonation and substitution probabilities as low as possible. And there's the usual trade-off between wanting to keep these things low while still keeping these things small. And there's a lot of different variations, just to give a sense of what's been covered in the literature. So there are variations that look at what happens if Alice and Bob have some kind of dispute as to whether something is valid. So I'm not going to cover those today at all. These authentication codes, they can be deterministic. The one we just looked at wasn't. So the ones where you have multiple possible encodings of a single source, these are what's known as splitting authentication codes. And that's going to be a focus of my talk today, that particular case. There are so-called Cartesian authentication codes that provide no confidentiality at all. So the message that gets sent fully reveals to anybody what the source was. And these are also not going to be the subject of my talk. Instead, I'm going to focus on kind of the opposite picture, which is where not only are these authentication codes providing authentication, but we're getting perfect secrecy at the same time. So these are sometimes called authentication and secrecy codes. And these have been widely studied in the deterministic setting, but there had been less attention on those in this splitting case. And one other thing to mention that, again, I won't be talking about today, you can kind of take this a bit further, this substitution notion, and instead of Bob just seeing one message, maybe he sees a whole bunch of messages before he makes his substitution. And so we have this notion of a T-fold spoofing attack. And again, that's another direction you can take this material. So I mentioned perfect secrecy. And if we have another look back at the silly little example, we'll find that this is, in fact, a case of an authentication and secrecy code. So if we look at the possible encodings of 0, you can see 1, 2, 3, 4, 0, 4, 0, 1, 2, 3. So we're getting every possible message happening twice if we look over the set of all keys. But then if you look at the set of all encodings for 1, again, 2, 3, 4, 0, 0, 3, 4, 0, 1, 2. We're getting the same total set of possible messages, each occurring with the same probabilities. So if you see a message, that's not, in this case, giving you any way of distinguishing was the source 0, was the source 1. And again, this should, to anyone who's familiar with just perfect secrecy of encryption schemes and the one-time pad and things, it's a well-known result that to get perfect secrecy, the number of keys has to be at least as big as the number of messages. And we're in this authentication setting where we're trying to achieve this extra property. So in general, we're going to need even more keys. So just to give a feeling of how inefficient for daily use these are, that's the sort of world we're working in here. So not to dwell on these too long, but other than turning geometries into authentication codes, what else is there in the literature? So a very natural thing to look at is trying to find bounds in terms of the parameters on how small can these probabilities be, how many keys do I have to have? And this is just a small subset and of things that have been proven. And these look a little bit unwieldy with all these mins and maxes and so on. But for something like the code we've been looking at, where a lot of things are the same size, these are actually neater than they seem. So if we look at this impersonation bound, we're told the impersonation probability has got to be at least, in the worst case. So here we have the union over all possible sources. So for a given key, the number of different encodings of that source. So that's just looking along one row of my table and seeing how many entries are in that row. And in the table we looked at, there were 4 entries in each row, and the number of messages was 5. So the bound is saying 4 out of 5, which is actually what that authentication code achieved. So that code was tight with respect to that bound, and we could work through a similar process for this bound on the substitution probability, and that code was actually tight with respect to that bound as well. So when I said it wasn't a very good code, it was the best it could be given the parameters. It was really just too small to achieve useful probabilities. But I guess one other result to mention is we've got this other bound here, that we've got this lower bound happening for the number of keys. So depending on how low you want to get these probabilities, there's a cost to pay in having to take potentially larger numbers of keys in order to obtain this. And you can see sort of a range of dates for these bounds: 84, 91, 99. This second bound in the literature here actually ends up being a corrected version of an earlier bound that wasn't actually correct. They, I think, maybe had some maxes and mins the wrong way around or something like that. And that's partly the trouble with trying to study these things. When you have all these probability distributions floating around, you have to be very specific. Like if you're taking expectations and that sort of thing, which distribution am I talking about now? Which things are changing? Which things are being fixed? And I think it's challenging to get the notation set up sufficiently precisely that it is really clear what you're actually calculating, what you're actually talking about, to avoid making those sorts of mistakes. So I'm going to briefly bring in something that was really the reason that I started ultimately looking at authentication codes. And this was at Eurocrypt 2008. We had this new idea invented, these so-called algebraic manipulation detection codes. So the title of the paper, Detection of Algebraic Manipulation with Applications to Robust Secret Sharing and Fuzzy Extractors. And essentially this paper was, I'm going to come back to the secret sharing later, so if that's less familiar, don't worry at this point. But it was taking techniques that have been used in constructing certain secret sharing schemes and trying to abstract what are these techniques doing if we separate them from the secret sharing, and can we use these techniques in other places? And as the name would suggest, we've got something algebraic going on. So previously, you could see that table I set up, everything was just combinatorial. We were counting where things were occurring. We just had finite sets without a priori having any algebraic structure. Here, we're going to start with an abelian group. And at its simplest level, an algebraic manipulation detection code is just a collection of disjoint subsets, A1 up to AM, of that group. But what makes it interesting is what we're trying to do with it. And in a similar sort of flavor to what we're looking at, we take some source, like if we have sources S1 up to SM, and we want to encode that source by randomly picking an element. So for the ith source, we randomly pick an element from the ith set and encode it. And this time, what the attacker is doing, the attacker doesn't see any of this. He doesn't know what we've picked, but the attacker is just going to choose some element from the group, some element delta. And what's going to happen is my nice encoded element is going to get that delta added to it. And a bit like in the substitution attack, what the attacker is trying to do is cause, when we add that delta to SI, he wants the result to move the SI from a value that was in AI to something that's in a different one of the sets in the collection. So again, similar idea, trying to fool me. I thought I had an element from this set, but now when I look at it again, I've got an element from this set. And so you can calculate the probability that he's going to succeed at that. But turns out these things really are closely related to authentication codes. And Doug and I started looking at these, I think it was maybe 2014 or so. And I think one of the things that was confusing us at first was these look a lot like an authentication code, but at the same time, not. So there's a lot of similarity with this whole encoding substitution thing, but in particular, they don't have any keys. There was nothing keyed going on. So how does that relate? And it turns out there's a very direct construction that will get you from an AMD code to an authentication code. And that's basically just develop it for all you design theorists out there. And if we look at this example that we had before, if instead of just taking 0, 1, 2, 3, 4 to be a set, elements in a set, we can think of them as Z5. And the same for so for both the keys and the messages, we're working in this group Z5. So if we now look across our first row of our table, where we've got our encodings of 0, we've got 2 subsets of Z5, and they're disjoint from each other. By construction for an authentication code, they'll have to be disjoint. So we can regard this first element of my table here as being an AMD code. And then you can see that I've made the second row by just adding 1 to everything in the first row and so on. So I've got my AMD code in my first row, I've developed it, and that's how I made this authentication code. And what's interesting about doing this is it's possible to prove that the probability of success in attacking the authentication code in the worst case is exactly the worst case substitution probability of the resulting authentication code. And you can kind of go back the other way if you define, and if you like, some kind of automorphism group on the authentication code. If you happen to have an authentication code that has this structure of essentially all the rows having come from a single row being developed, then if you're getting a full orbit like this, in that situation, you've got this basically equivalence between the authentication code with these properties and the AMD code. And so at this point, you might think, well, okay, we thought we had a new object. In fact, it's just an old object. And in particular, this means that the older bounds on authentication codes might apply in this new context. And yes, they do. And actually, a lot of these bounds were reproved in this context already before the connection was properly explained. Turns out, actually, it's a little bit easier to prove them when you're working in this setting where you've got the group structure to work with, but it is subject to these same results. But it turns out that isn't the whole story here. And by looking a little bit more closely at these properties of these schemes that are coming from these AMD codes, I think some of these properties are kind of interesting to try and understand what do we need from these AMD codes, sorry, from these authentication codes, if instead of just treating them as a standalone object for its own sake, we would like to be able to use them in a more modular way with other cryptographic primitives to somehow exploit the authentication from the authentication codes to strengthen other cryptographic primitives in various ways. And the natural notion that was the setting for these AMD codes is an example of secret sharing. So we have the idea of a K out of N threshold scheme. We've got some finite set of secrets. We have a collection of N different players in this scheme. And what we want to do is share one of these secrets by giving a share, some piece of information to each of the players. And we want that if K of these players get together and combine their shares, they should uniquely recover the secret. But if we have fewer than K players, then the shares that they have shouldn't give them any information about the secret in an information theoretic sense. So it's not just that they can't uniquely determine the secret, they literally don't learn anything more about it through having that set of shares. And this is obviously a very well-studied object. And you'll notice here, we're only talking about secrecy. And so we're protecting against passive attacks, somebody who's trying to learn the secret just by observing what they're allowed to observe. But what they don't inherently do is protect against any active attacks where people are changing values in the scheme. So one thing we might be worried about is when the players are combining their shares to recover the secret. We've got our nice authorized set, K players. It's big enough, they've got enough information. But what if one of the players lies? And instead of their share being 0, they say, my share is really 1, to try and fool the other players. We'd like to be able to detect when this sort of malicious behavior is going on. So to achieve secret sharing, the well-known Shamir secret sharing scheme is a very nice scheme. I should apologize, this slide I stole from a talk I gave to undergraduates. So where we say ZP, that can actually be any finite field. So this scheme is based on polynomial interpolation. Secret S is going to be an element of our finite field. We're going to construct a polynomial F where that secret is the constant term. We're going to choose random coefficients to build the rest of our polynomial. And then we're going to give shares to the players that consist of points on the polynomial. So I'm thinking of these gray dots here as being these points, giving 1 point to each player. And then if I have some set of K players who combine their points, as our polynomial has degree K minus 1, that's enough points to do polynomial interpolation. So these players can say, great, that's our polynomial. And then by looking at the y-intercept, that's how they get the secret. So this is a very convenient in many ways scheme and well used. And if we're starting with Shamir's secret sharing scheme, but we would like to be able to somehow protect against these cheating players who are trying to return the wrong secrets, you know, give some point up here instead of actually on the polynomial, we can use an AMD code to do it. And the trick here is, instead of letting any field element be your secret, if you have an AMD code where the group that you're operating in is the additive group of that finite field, what you can do is say, well, I'm treating this group as the set of possible encodings from a smaller set of sources. So if you've got this smaller set of secrets corresponding to the sources, you start by encoding them using your AMD code, and then you construct Shamir's secret sharing scheme of that encoded value rather than the source directly. Once the players recover their secret, they can use the algebraic manipulation detection code to detect algebraic manipulation. So if somebody's increased their share by a little bit, that's going to, because everything's linear here, increase correspondingly the recovered secret by a little bit. And this is where we're getting our adding delta to the value that was happening in the AMD code. So in this algebraic setting, we've got this very nice modular tool where we can say, take our well-known ingredient of Shamir's secret sharing scheme, take our well-known ingredient of our now well-known ingredient of our AMD code, and just combine them. So by taking something which provides the secrecy, taking something which is giving us authentication, that's giving us something now that maintains secrecy even when we have active attacks. So we're giving this extra robustness to something that just provided the secrecy. So now we have a way of doing this algebraically, but what we're wondering is there a purely combinatorial way of doing this? So secret sharing has certainly got a lot of combinatorial structure that's been well studied, connections with matroids, et cetera, et cetera. You can certainly describe a K out of N threshold scheme in a purely combinatorial way without requiring fields, well, without explicitly requiring fields, and so on. We've seen we can have authentication codes that are purely combinatorial, that don't need this algebraic constructure. And even if we do this combination of Shamir's secret sharing scheme AMD code, if we kind of describe that resulting bigger scheme, again, in a table similar to the sort of thing we've been setting up, but for the secret sharing scheme, it's really the combinatorial properties of that table that are determining the security. So the algebra made it convenient to construct, it made it convenient to analyze, but fundamentally the fact that it's providing security, these are combinatorial properties arising from the algebra. So it'd be interesting to understand kind of, is there a purely combinatorial way that we can have this modular use an authentication code to make my secret sharing scheme more secure? And so it is known that you can start with a robust secret sharing scheme and construct an authentication code. So that's kind of a necessary ingredient in there already. Like no matter what you do for your robust secret sharing scheme, hiding in there is this sort of authentication thing, but that's not the whole story. It turns out that just being an authentication code isn't enough. There's more properties that are needed here. So in particular, for the secret sharing scheme application, you need to have the perfect secrecy. And this is coming from the secrecy that you need as part of the secret sharing scheme. In order to maintain that, the authentication code has to be one with perfect secrecy. And you also need another property that wasn't really one that was studied through the 90s. And that's this notion of a key substitution attack. So Oscar, instead of seeing a message, replacing it by another message, what if Oscar didn't see the message, but he happened to see the key and replaced it by a different key? For a given message, is that going to have the result of making Bob accept the wrong source? So it turns out that for the secret sharing application, this is a property that you need as well. And so in terms of questions that I think are interesting, Doug and I were able to show that if you have an authentication code that's got perfect secrecy and you've got security against key substitution attacks, as well as your standard substitution security, then that's enough to give you a 2 out of 2 threshold secret sharing scheme. So if you've got 2 players and you need both of them to get the secret, you can do that just with an authentication code. But I would really like to know, is there a way to sort of start with that basis and then turn it into a K out of N threshold scheme? And haven't found anything that works yet. But you kind of, if you're thinking back to the analog with just encryption, I guess this would be like, just a secret sharing scheme that just provides confidentiality. If you had a Latin square, you could turn that into a 2 out of 2 secret sharing scheme. But this, for example, Shamir's secret sharing scheme construction is going further. It's getting us our K out of N. So in this robust secret sharing world, we've got, the equivalent of our Latin square construction. And so what we want to know is what does it take to extend it? So one combinatorial aspect to comment on that seems relevant here is this notion of duality. Because you can think of this key substitution attack as being somehow dual to the normal substitution attack. And if we took our authentication code, like that little example we were looking at, if you were to swap the roles of the keys and the encoded messages, what you would end up with could be viewed as a new AMD code, sorry, that should say authentication code, really. You would have a new authentication code where the substitution probability of the original code turns into the key substitution probability of the new code. And so the tricky thing is, can you design your code in the first place so that it has both the substitution and the key substitution properties? So when you take the dual, the resulting code still has an okay substitution probability, okay key substitution probability. And in the case of, one thing about these AMD codes is you get this duality for free, right? Because if you fix a group element, you can construct these sets AI prime, which is just, so A1 prime is what is the set of group elements that if I add to my fixed T will give me things that were in the original set A1. A2 prime would be things that I have to add to T to get my original set A2 and so on. And you get this dual authentication code that's the same, basically. All the probabilities are the same, the properties are the same, the number of keys is the same as the number of encodings. So it's certainly nice to have this sort of self-dual thing going on, though not strictly needed. And so I guess the question here is, why is this interesting? Why do I think it's interesting, at least? And I think this one specific example, in this case of this key substitution, trying to understand this particular use highlights some new security properties. So these are things that, you know, you may or may not think is relevant for the basic scenario of Bob sends Alice a message. But if we want to use these codes in more sophisticated ways, do become important. And if you're just interested in the combinatorial structure, new security properties means new things we need these tables to be doing. So potentially combinatorially interesting things to study. And these AMD codes and various nice examples of these, certainly in the literature, there's been quite a bit of interest, let's say the past 5 or so years, looking at constructions for new versions of these. And the example that I've shown you, secret sharing, you might think that's a bit niche, but secret sharing, again, interesting in its own right, useful as an ingredient in other things. So particular multi-party computation, lots of approaches to doing secure multi-party computation are based around secret sharing. So the idea is you have a bunch of participants who each maybe know some values. They want to compute some function of their values, but they don't want to reveal their values, or they don't want to reveal any more information than is necessarily revealed by the output of that function. And it depends on your sense of taste and your notions of what's important, but certainly there are certainly people who view multi-party computation as one of the central notions of cryptography, because you can express so many other cryptographic objects in terms of multi-party computation schemes. And you know, may or may not be your preferred way of looking at things, but it does connect ultimately secret sharing into a lot of other cryptographic contexts. Anything where you're trying to do anything distributed. So, you know, the inherent thing of distributing a key, but also distributing some kind of calculation, maybe on ciphertexts or whatever. There's a lot of things that can be built out of these secret sharing schemes. And so we kind of have this two-way relationship. So if an authentication code can be used as a building block in constructing something else, knowledge of authentication codes can be used to actually give us knowledge of that thing. So like I said before, if you take a robust secret sharing scheme, you can derive an authentication code from that. And in particular, that means results like the bounds on the parameters of the authentication code then translate directly into bounds on the parameters of the secret sharing scheme. So I think this unconditionally secure world of cryptography a lot of the point of considering it is really about understanding, because if you're studying schemes that are fundamentally not practical for use in practice, what is it that you're trying to understand? And I think where we're getting these sort of idealized, really strong security properties, knowing what sort of structures lead to that, knowing what are the limitations, like these bounds, we can't do that unless we have this many keys, unless we do this thing or that thing. That's giving some kind of insight into the world of that problem that we're trying to study, even if in practice we're not going to be using these unconditionally secure schemes. I think from a point of view of really understanding what does security mean in this context, what does security of authentication mean? I think it matters to have a good understanding. And therefore, this modular approach, that's letting us hopefully take more complicated notions like our robust secret sharing scheme. And if we can simplify it by saying, well, let's get a clear picture of this one little thing that's contributing to it, this authentication component of this bigger thing, that's giving us a way of breaking down the security into things that we can understand more clearly. And if we can then understand how they relate to each other, that's giving us a better picture of the whole system. And I think a lot of the point of studying this stuff is to get this sort of extra intuition, or at least from my perspective. So for example, in the secret sharing, in the authentication code, where we had this splitting where you could have multiple encodings of something, that's fairly natural in this authentication code context. When it's buried in the middle of a big secret sharing scheme, it's a lot harder to see that that's going on. And you can see places in the literature where there are bounds that are kind of not quite as strong as they could be, because they haven't had a clear picture of where this thing is being encoded as a set of this size. There wasn't a notation for set of this size in the middle of this larger construction. And I think another point that I want to make is results and techniques can be forgotten when an area is no longer fashionable. So I've been giving plenty of talks in a range of different settings, both to mathematicians and to cryptographers. And certainly for anyone younger than me, they've never heard of authentication codes. This is, I think, the people who are working on them seem to have done their bit and were a bit tired of the excesses of some of the geometers, perhaps. And then the trouble is that then the whole field just gets kind of parked, and the important things that were learned are not being passed on. So I think, I hope among all of this that I've given sort of some suggestion that there are some problems that certainly haven't been resolved, or I don't feel like I've been able to find anywhere a resolution to them, potentially combinatorially interesting aspects of problems. And I think there's definitely an argument to be made that these are still things that are worthy of attention. Thanks very much.